Before you judge what you're about to hear as fiction, remember that in the past there was no electricity, no cameras, and no explanations for strange things. Houses were dark, silence was heavy, and even the smallest sound could be a warning. This story isn't about an abandoned mansion or a distant palace in the desert. It's about a cheap rental house occupied by a poor family who didn't know they weren't alone. This is the story of a woman who faced what lived inside the house to protect her children, and the story of a name that once spoken made fear begin. Qandil. When my grandmother moved into the new house, she didn't know it was haunted. She, my grandfather, my mother, and my aunt were living there. My mother and aunt were still very young. My grandfather had moved for a new job in Fayoum Governorate. He worked as a night guard at a shuna, a place where grain was stored. This was a very long time ago, before electricity reached homes. The house my grandfather rented was old, and people knew what was inside it. That's why no one wanted to live there. The rent was cheap, and the owner was named Qandil. Because of my grandfather's job, he often spent nights away from home. So my grandmother stayed alone with my mother and aunt. From the moment they moved in, strange and frightening things began to happen. But my grandmother wasn't easily scared, and she never talked about them, so the children wouldn't be afraid, and because they had no money to move somewhere else. My grandfather's situation was hard, and even though the rent was cheap, it often piled up and he paid every 2 or 3 months. At first, the things that happened were mild. While cooking on the kerosene stove, she would leave the food for a moment and come back to find the fire extinguished. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but when it kept happening, she started to feel that something was not normal. Sometimes the gas lamp in the middle of the staircase would turn off by itself. She would go down and relight it 2 or 3 times every night, until the first truly terrifying incident happened. It was night, after dinner. We were asleep, and she was lying beside us. She heard a donkey braying downstairs. She thought my grandfather had returned. He used to go to work and come back riding a donkey. But the sound continued. My grandfather didn't climb the stairs, and he didn't call out to her like he always did. So she got up and walked toward the staircase to see what was going on. By the light of the gas lamp in the middle of the stairs, she looked down. She didn't see the donkey. She saw my mother, carrying my aunt on her shoulder, jumping and playing, both of them looking up at her. Their eyes were full of defiance, as if they were saying, "If you're not afraid, come down." My grandmother froze in shock. She stepped back, sought refuge in God from the accursed devil, then rushed back to the room and found my real mother and aunt sleeping peacefully. She sat beside them, whispering prayers and asking forgiveness. The next day, while talking with her neighbor on the rooftop as usual, my grandmother finally asked her neighbor, "Does this house have something in it?" The neighbor understood the question, but didn't want to tell her the truth so she wouldn't be scared. But when my grandmother insisted and swore her to tell what she knew, the neighbor finally spoke. Long ago, Qandil, the owner's mother, had fallen into the stairwell from the 3rd floor and died. She died in the same place where the donkey was now tied. After that, my mother said she would sometimes hear my grandmother speaking softly, saying, "And then what, Qandil? May God forgive you, Qandil. All right, Qandil. I have small children with me, Qandil." When my mother asked who Qandil was, my grandmother would say, "She's a friend of mine. I like talking to her." She said that to calm the entity down, to make it stop its tricks, or to make it feel that she wasn't alone and had small girls with her. But Qandil would disappear, then return with another cruel prank. One of the most terrifying incidents happened at noon while my grandmother was cleaning the downstairs area. Suddenly, her feet froze to the ground, as if something was holding them. She lost control of her entire body. It felt like someone had thrown a bucket full of strong perfume over her. The smell was overpowering.
Her body ached intensely, and she was completely paralyzed. Even her tongue, she tried to move it, to say anything, but it was as if it were tied. After several minutes, sensation slowly returned to her legs and body. Her tongue loosened little by little. She began reciting whatever verses of the Quran she knew until her legs finally released. She ran upstairs to check on her daughters, completely broken and crying. But the worst incident, the one that made her finally tell my grandfather everything and leave the house forever, happened on a Thursday night. She was preparing a heavy dinner. She was busy with onions, garlic, meat, and soup. The garlic ran out, so she went up to the rooftop to get a bundle she had stored there. When she came back down and entered the kitchen, she saw Qandil for the first time. An old woman, dressed in black, with white, tangled hair, sitting on a small wooden chair in front of the stove, holding a spoon as if she were cooking. When she sensed my grandmother standing behind her, she turned, looked at her, and screamed, "I don't want you here! Leave the house!" My grandmother screamed at the top of her lungs and collapsed onto the floor in absolute terror. She left the food, grabbed my mother and aunt, and decided that this would be her last night in the house. That same night, my grandfather returned happy. It was almost the only night he ever slept at home. Usually he slept during the day. He entered riding the donkey, humming, and the house was dark. Suddenly, Qandil appeared from a corner and said in a terrifying voice, "Where is the rent, Abdel Sattar?" The donkey panicked and started thrashing. My grandfather fell off, terrified, and ran upstairs shouting, "She asked me where the rent is! She asked me where the rent is!" He already knew the house wasn't normal. Strange things happened to him, too, but he never told my grandmother, so she wouldn't be afraid. The next morning, they packed their belongings and left the house, never to return. This is a true story told by one of my followers.